this is a wonderful opportunity to talk about myself, and of course I find myself a fascinating subject. And so this will be partly autobiographical, but mostly my music, and I'm delighted to be able to present it to you. As a sort of a basic thing, perhaps I should tell you about the diversity of interests that I had as a child. I gave up the violin at the age of 8 after having studied it with a very conservative old violin teacher who was 75 when I was 5, and he didn't allow me to hear any nonsense such as Schubert and Schumann, no modernism at all. In fact, it was all right, Haydn and Mozart and early Beethoven, but nothing beyond this to harm the sensitivity of a child. Anyway, then I heard my father, who was an Irishman, hum Irish tunes, and my mother, who had come from the South and the Ozarks, to hum old American mountain tunes. And I lived in San Francisco in the middle of the Oriental section, and my playmates included Japanese, Chinese, and Tahitians. And so I hummed, each in its own language, the tunes along with the rest of them, and this gave me a sort of an international base, which I've never entirely lost, as some of you know, because I do occasionally on this station give programs which show my interest in music of other people's as well as my own. I think that I had better begin a little bit later on now. I composed wildly and feverishly in my early teen-age years, and when I was 15 years old I was invited to write music for an Irish play. And this was an Irish mythological play which had to do with Manannán, the god of motion and the god of the sea. And I was invited to write the theatrical music which would introduce the home of Manannán, the god of the sea, and especially in regard to the tides, the deep tides of Manannán. And I had to write some music that would put you in the mood of the deep tides as well as the waves of the sea. And this was rather big job for a 15-year-old boy. And so I always thought in terms of making the musical materials fit the idea, and I tried a couple of low octaves in certain rhythm, and they sounded just a little too definite, and so then I tried a couple of chords which were better than the bare octaves with the same low tidal rhythm. But this wasn't quite enough, and so then I got the idea of having all 13 of the lowest tones of the piano played together at the same time. But since I didn't have 13 fingers in the left hand, I played this with the flat of the hand, being very careful to get all the notes exactly equal and to have what I considered a reasonable tone quality there. In other words, I was inventing a new musical sound later to be called tone clusters. But I played this first in San Francisco about 50 years ago and last month. Anyway, this was my professional debut as a composer, and also I had a lot of trouble with that particular piece because my piano playing friends said, "Didn't anybody ever tell you that you use the tips of your fingers to play the piano with? You don't use your whole hand all at once." I said, yes, I very often do play with the tips of my fingers, but this time I have to have all 13 tones at once, and so I couldn't use them. Then my composition friends came around with another angle. They said, "Didn't anybody ever tell you that you select tones for a chord? You don't just use all the tones at once for a chord, you select them." I said, yes, I often do select tones, but this time I want them all. Then came the real point. So then the composition friend said, "Aha, but now you have used up all the tones of the scale at once. How do you develop this idea? You already have them all." So then I thought that perhaps you could develop the idea by having 2 octaves of all the tones at once instead of 1. But if I did this with the flats of 2 hands, then it used everything up and I didn't have anything to do anything else with. And so I learned to play the 2 octaves very precisely with the whole forearm. And of course this made me infamous before I'd even begun to play anywhere, practically. because people watched the forearm and didn't listen much to the music, in spite of the fact that now very few people take any exception to the music at all. In fact, people say it's old-fashioned, which of course it is, being written over 50 years ago. But I thought maybe you would like to hear first this rather childish effort, The Tides of Manannan, in which I do use the flat of the hand and sometimes the whole forearm in the bass section against a tune which of course is my own, although quite Irish in its nature. You've just heard Deep Tides, and I'm Henry Cowell, and this is my piece. This was written at the age of 15, and when I was 16 and 17, I got a great spell of being very modernistic, and in fact investigated dissonance a good deal during those teen years. Another thing that I had in mind very often, which seems to have been quite unconventional, although I still do occupy myself with it somewhat, is the idea that you select different means owing to what the idea is that you are going to express in the music. And this is sometimes a musical idea, and sometimes it isn't quite a musical idea. In this particular case, there was a piece written somewhere around 1914, which is called Advertisement. This advertisement certainly had to do with Impressionism, of advertising as it existed around Times Square at this time, and it's full of dissonance and sharpness, and it's fun. It's meant to be a little amusement piece. A minute of it is enough probably, but anyway, there's only a minute of it. That was advertisement, which I played for you on a record, an earlier piece. Now perhaps I should begin introducing myself in my 20s. This seems to be chronological so far, but it isn't all the way through. Anyway, in the early 20s, I thought that I would do something many other composers had done before me, and that is to try to compose a piece on an Aeolian harp. This is a kind of a little wind harp, and you can stretch silk threads quite tightly and then hang this in the window and wait for a breeze. And if you get a breeze and a tone, then this will be an Aeolian harp. And so I thought how nice it would be if instead of having to play on the keyboard of the piano, you could only play directly on the strings, because they sound so much more like a harp and so much more like wind. They're not exactly like a harp, of course, but I thought, well, you can't do this because you can't control the tones that you're going to play on the strings. But in this particular case, I found a way. And so the Aeolian harp is the first time that I ever used the strings of the piano played on directly. This must have been around 1922 or 3, I think, that I did this. That was Aeolian harp, which I played on the strings of the piano, composed about 1922 or 3. Then I had some other ideas about strings of the piano too. It seemed to me if you could handle them that way, and they made such a fascinating sound, that they might be able to be handled in other ways too. And so, although Banshee is a very short piece, it took several years of experiment to see just exactly how strange sounds might be woven into something which is a logical musical composition with some kind of a form, and especially to write it down. When you hear this next piece, the Banshee, I think you will agree that it's rather a feat to get it written down at all, and this was maybe 1924 or 5-ish, I don't remember exactly. Anyway, concerning the title, I'm sure that every true Irishman knows what a Banshee is. He's an ancestor of yours, a woman who lives in the inner world and comes out to take the soul of the dead back to the inner world if somebody in your family dies. And she doesn't like the physical plane, and so you'll hear her wailing at the time that she has to come to take the spirit back. And only if you belong to this family will you hear her wail. And they do say that if you belong to a very fine old Irish family, you'll have a more experienced, louder wailing Banshee. And just before I play this, I must tell you a funny, true story about it. I one time played this on the Hamburg radio many years ago, before people had gotten used to piano strings, and they offered a prize of 20 marks to anybody who would write in and tell them the instrument on which this piece was played. They did not have to pay out anything at all. Nobody thought this was being played on a piano. But I've told you the secret. That was the Banshee, and I'm Henry Cowell, and this is a composition which I played on the strings of the piano, in case you wondered what was going on. Anyway, this was something that was written in the early to mid-20s, but before this time I had interested myself a great deal in the playing of different rhythms at the same time. And sometimes people were disappointed in the results of this simply because it didn't sound very spectacular and because it was lyrical and you didn't know just exactly what was going on unless you looked at the music and tried to play it yourself. But I have a record here of my playing of my piece called Fabric. And Fabric is in 3 different rhythms at the same time. 2 is possible, although somewhat difficult. 3 is almost impossible, but I learned how to do these things. When you listen to this, which is just played normally on the piano keys for a change, you will find the principal melody is in the middle, and there's a bass, and then there is a counter melody on top. And these are always in 3 different rhythms at the same time. In measure number 1, for instance, the top part is in 6 to the measure, and the middle part, which has the main melody, can be counted in 5, and the lower part in 8. And then this immediately shifts to 9 in the bass and 7 in the middle, and again 6 on top, and so on. Every measure changes, and this all sounds very quiet and serene until you try to play it. Anyway, this is Fabric. What you just heard was Fabric. This is a piano piece in 3 different rhythms at once. I'm Henry Cowell, and this is a composition of mine. Now I want to go ahead with the last one of the piano pieces that I will play for you at this time. This is my piece, which is called Tiger, and was written about 1928. I didn't write many things for piano in the 30s or later than this 28 piece, but this particular one is loud and rather modernistic, and I thought of Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright, so maybe this is partly a programmatic piece. I don't know. Anyway, this is something that I wanted to do. I'll tell you a couple of little tales about this that might be of some interest on the side. In 1929, early in the spring, I was invited to go and to play in Russia, and I played 30 concerts in 30 days, 1 concert a day, every day at the conservatory in Moscow, among other things. And one of the things that everybody wanted to hear over again was this piece, The Tiger, because it was so loud and so vicious. Anyway, I soon learned that if I was asked to play something over again, it meant they didn't understand it, not that they liked it. This is something perhaps to note about audiences here. Anyway, I was very much interested that they were in a position where they insisted on hearing something over again until they felt that they understood it as well as they could. Then I was invited to publish something in the state edition. I still think I'm the only American ever to have been published in the state edition there. Anyway, this Tiger is one of the things that was published in the state edition in 1929 early. And I had just played it for them and given them the manuscript, the board of editors, and we were drinking glasses of tea, and then a nice young lady came out from the office of the treasurer and handed me a roll of bills and some small coins. And I said, well, what's this? And she said, oh, this is the payment on the first edition. We thought you might like to use it while you're here, because we couldn't send it out. And I said, yes, but this isn't a round sum. You're handing me some actual bills and small coins. What does this mean? She said, oh, we counted the notes. We pay 10 kopecks per quarter note here. The other thing about this tiger is my review from the London Times, which is always right, as I'm sure you know. And the London Times said that whatever else this piece proves, it proves Mr. Cowell to be the world's loudest pianist. This is The Tiger, a piano piece which I played for you here on a record. And now I think I'll leave my piano works and go into some other sorts of things. In the late 20s and in the 30s, around the San Francisco region, and in fact all over the coast, there were composers, several of us, who began writing music for the modern dance. The general thought was, if there were a group of dancers who liked to use the music for the modern dance, that they then trained themselves in the playing of percussion instruments as amateurs, and they would have a percussion orchestra, and a sort of music arose that could be played by dancers who were resting, while other dancers danced. And this music was ideal for the modern dance in this stage. And I composed some of it, as well as such composers as John Cage and Lou Harrison, with whom I was associated. They were both students of mine at one time. And we developed a new kind of percussion orchestra music for amateur percussors at this time. And then it got so that it was less and less amateurish. And now we have in this recording Mr. Price's group here, consisting of very, very skilled percussion men who play something called an ostinato pianissimo, which has to be played by very good performers indeed, although not usually the usual percussion section of a symphony. You've just been hearing a percussion orchestra piece called Ostinato Pianissimo, and this was played by Paul Price's orchestra, and it's by Henry Cowell, and I'm Henry Cowell. So if you want to ask me anything, please don't, because fortunately you can't get at me, at least not right at the minute. Anyway, suppose we go on from this to a chamber piece, which is called a set of five. This set of five is for violin, piano, and one percussion player. And the artists are Anahid and Maro Ajamian. the violinist and pianist, and Eldon Bailey, who plays percussion, doing a job of playing several different things at different times, rather delicately. The piece was actually written for Anahid and Maro Ajamian, and they play it here. The set of 5 consists then of 5 diversified movements. During these movements, the pianist sometimes plays the tone clusters, sometimes on the strings of the piano, and the percussion makes this then slightly different from an ordinary violin and piano piece. Here it is. just heard Set of Five, played by Anahid and Maro Ajamian and Eldon Bailey, violin, piano, and percussion. And this is by Henry Cowell, and I am he. So you have me. I commented already, and so we shall go ahead. And I should like to introduce my fourth symphony. This is the first symphony of mine that has actually been performed. My numbers 1, 2, and 3 still remain in their virgin state. The fourth symphony was written especially for Kusevitsky and the Boston Symphony Orchestra. He invited me to write him a nice little symphony, and so I said I would, and so this is a nice little symphony. But the present recording is conducted by Howard Hanson, and the Eastman Rochester Orchestra is the orchestra which you will hear. The symphony itself is a more or less conservative sounding symphony, although if you listen carefully it won't be so conservative after all. The conservatism is only for people who don't listen properly in my music throughout, I think you'll find. Anyway, this is a symphony of Americana to a certain extent. The first movement has 3 themes, and each one of these are somewhat in a style, somewhat elaborated, of an old American hymn tune. First, you have a kind which is a little bit like a German chorale. Second, you have a more sentimental type of hymn tune, such as everybody at one time used to sing. And third, you have the more severe kinds of shape note hymn tunes that are known to be early American and to be found around Boston and around the states of the South. The second movement, which is rather impressionistic in style, features a melody of mine which, however, is very much like a ballad tune, a Camogli tune. And after you get done hearing flutes and things, notice the coming in of the English horn in it, because it'll slip in unawares unless you specially look for this. The third movement is like a scherzo, but when I write a scherzo, being a true California-born Irishman, I usually write jigs and reels, and this is in the form of a jig, while the last movement, more seriously, in counterpoint, picks up all of the threads of the others and gives you a polyphonic ending. This, then, is my fourth symphony, conducted by Howard Hanson with the Eastman Rochester Orchestra.